We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get videos weekly. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. Joel McIver is our guest to talk about his book, To Live Is to Die, The Life and Death of Metallica's Cliff Burton, revised 3rd edition. In the book Rob Flynn of Machine Head calls one of the best biographies you'll ever read, McIver is back with a revised edition of the story behind Metallica's original bassist, Cliff Burton. Cliff led the band from garage thrash to sophisticated progressive heights, thanks in large part to his songwriting ability and phenomenal bass skills on the band's first 3 studio albums, including the masterpiece Master of Puppets from 1986. Sadly, Cliff's life came to an early end. He was just 24 when he died in a tour bus crash in Sweden on September 27, 1986. Following his passing, Metallica went on to massive global success, but even they admit they've never pushed their creative envelope as radically as they had during the first 4 years of their career. To coincide with the 40th anniversary of Metallica's debut album, Kill 'Em All, McIver's revised and updated edition, originally published in 2009, adds a new chapter that looks at Cliff Burton's legacy from a fresh perspective and includes commentary from current Metallica bassist Robert Trujillo and Aquaman star Jason Momoa, as well as an eyewitness account of the opening of the Cliff Burton Museum in Sweden in 2022. Testament bassist Steve DiGiorgio also adds his memories of meeting Cliff as a teen and then watching he and his band, Metallica, begin to take off. We'll talk about the life and career of Cliff Burton and some of what's in this brand new edition of To Live Is to Die in this episode with author Joel McIver. A playlist of Cliff Burton-era Metallica in the show notes page. But first, here is Joel McIver. Joel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on.
This is a phenomenal book. Originally came out in 2009, and since then, the admiration and love for Cliff Burton's work with Metallica has only grown, according to your opening note in the book. That's what encouraged you and Jawbone Press to publish this 3rd edition of what is still the only book about him, which is hard to believe. What inspired you to write the original version?
Oh, it was just a dream of mine, Eric. I mean, when I started out as an author, you know, there were only a couple of books I wanted to do. I wanted to do a book about Slayer. I wanted to do a book about Metallica, you know, their whole career. And then I wanted to do a Cliff Burton book. I'd been a bass player since I was a kid and always admired his playing and particularly gravitated towards that era of Metallica's career as well. So it seemed high time. I remember in 2008 when I was putting together the idea for the book and the pitch to Jawbone Press, that someone did a sort of fully comprehensive picture of Cliff. And I always want to say, oh, it's a tribute to Cliff, and you know, and it is, but that diminishes its function. As I've said a couple of times in the past, when you do a book about someone who has died and died tragically young, it's very easy to put that person on a pedestal and kind of paint them as a saint, and in, you know, which is fine. Often that can be a deserved, correct way to do it. But I thought Cliff and his family and his fans would be better served by just painting an accurate picture of the man with all his flaws, the flaws that we all have, right? So it is a tribute, but it's also my attempt to do as objectively journalistic a job on portraying him as I could. So one of the fabulous things which you might be going to ask me about was the number of people who just lined up to be interviewed. It was incredible, man. The people who were very, very keen, because I think there's so much sadness about Cliff still, and people wanted to talk about him. So that really made my job a lot easier and the book better as a result.
And one of them is Steve DiGiorgio, who's the basis for Testament. He's in the new book, part of the additional material in this latest edition. And we don't want to give away the whole story, but can you talk a little bit about what he writes in the book? He met Cliff way back in 1985, right?
Right, yeah. So he talks about a couple of, the one occasion when he actually spoke to Cliff, and then a couple of occasions when he saw Metallica play. And he came across Cliff once or twice at gigs as well in the Bay Area. And really, as well as showing how affectionate he is towards Cliff and really giving us an expert view of Cliff's bass playing as well, by the way, which is an important thing. He also evokes what the Bay Area was like at that time, which is useful because I grew up in a small village in a remote area of England, right? Or as far away culturally and geographically as you can probably get from San Francisco at that time. So it was important to have him on board for several reasons. But his affection for Cliff's playing is huge and shines through his words, which really make him a perfect candidate. And the previous edition, as you know, had Frank Bello of Anthrax doing an introduction. Of course, he knew Cliff well because they had toured together. And Frank, who I've subsequently worked with on his autobiography since this book came out, was also full of sadness and regret at Cliff's early death. So he was a great candidate. And then, of course, the original edition of the book came with a foreword by Kirk Hammett of Metallica. Again, a great friend and close confidant of Cliff. So I like to think that those three guys, along with all the other people who are interviewed in the book, really do provide a deep, serious, but very affectionate picture of the man, which I think is important.
Of course, there was more to him than just playing bass. He was so important to the sound of Metallica.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the songs came on the first couple of albums anyway, came from the very early days, even before Cliff was part of the band. But what he did was he came in and added not only his solo bass parts, which define certain songs, For Whom the Bell Tolls obviously is one, and on Puppets you've got Orion and Damage Incorporated and those sort of iconic bass parts. I hate to use the word iconic because it's so cheesy in journalistic circles, but I think in this case it's merited. But over and above the songwriting contributions, what he brought to Metallica was I think a professional focus. As the story goes that most of us know, Metallica actually moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco because Cliff was there, and Cliff wanted to join the band, but he didn't want to make the move. Now, I can't think of many similar circumstances where an entire band has moved that huge distance just for a bass player. And yet they did it because they understood that Cliff had a certain talent and a certain gravitas. I had a really interesting talk with Ross Halfin, the photographer who also supplies the image of Cliff for the cover. And he told me that nothing happened in Metallica without Cliff's say-so. So because he was maybe 2 years older than the rest of them, and certainly more musically advanced at the early stage, he had a kind of seniority about him which the other guys respected and would run decisions past him. So over and above the musical contribution, there's also that as well. He was a kind of a big brother figure in the band, almost like an authority. And of course, Lars and James then took over the running of the band, in later years. But that's something which I think people don't understand so much, because the image of Cliff is that he was basically a sort of laid-back stoner. And because of that, you might not think he had much professional drive and sort of natural authority, but he definitely did have those things. He contributed in many different ways, basically, not just musically.
You've heard that phrase, old soul in a young man's body. I think of that when I think of Cliff Burton. And that forward by Kirk Hammett, he gets into the person, Cliff Burton. And towards the end of the book, you look back on the people you spoke with and the stories that you took in, and you say that Cliff was a man of contradictions. Could you talk about that and the overall impression of Cliff that you got from writing this book?
We're all people of contradictions, really, aren't we? We all want one thing and behave another way. And he was so young when he died, what were we like when we were, 25, 24 years old, really? The things we said, the things we did, and yet Cliff was able to step away from being a sort of a young headbanger, the stoner, like I said, who liked to hang around at his house. He wasn't keen on going out unless he had to. He liked to hang out with his girlfriend, Corinne, who I interviewed for the book. So there was that kind of sort of homely, folksy attitude to Cliff. But at the same time, he was a demon of a musician and a headbanger like no other. When he went on stage, that side of the stage was his domain. And he carved out a space musically, which was huge. I alluded to it a moment ago, but you have to remember, there's that bass solo on the first record, Anesthesia, which is, again, Steve Harris aside, I can't really think of too many bass players who dominate their band as much as Cliff did, especially at such an early age, especially with such other big personalities in the band. So if you're looking for a contradiction, that could be a good one, actually, that Cliff was a fairly sort of quiet person, but yet he occupied a big space. He carved out a huge niche for himself.
It's so interesting to read about the bands that he followed, too. Really eclectic. I think
that's great.
That's the appropriate word. Can you talk about the bands who influenced him and how jazz fusion captured his interest, too, which I found fascinating.
Right. And progressive rock as well. I mean, so one of his heroes was Geddy Lee of Rush. I mean, anybody who came up at that time listening to interesting heavy music would be into Geddy, especially if you're a bass player. And some of Geddy's stuff informed Cliff's playing. Steve Harris of Iron Maiden, obviously, was an influence. Geezer Butler of Black Sabbath. But he also went deep into classical theory, which he'd studied as a teenager with his teacher Steve Doherty, who I also interviewed for the book, which I think was a first. I'm not sure Steve had spoken on the record about teaching Cliff as a teenager. They studied the work of Bach and a couple of the canon of European classical music, some of which informed Cliff's bass playing. You can hear it clearly in Anesthesia, for example. But also hardcore punk was this thing, British punk as well, like bands like Discharge. And, and all that complemented the sort of the standard new wave of British heavy metal stuff that Lars and James loved so much. And you had this kind of weird mishmash of music that came out in some, it's a miracle that it happened, Eric, really. So many other bands were doing something broadly similar, at the time. You could compare Slayer's first album with Metallica's first album, and the similarities are there. You had all the other bands coming up right after them, like Dark Angel and Death Angel from, LA and San Francisco. It didn't have to be Metallica who came up. It's just that they had the songs and the name and the drive and the image, and they had something different about them. And part of what was different was Cliff. So the fact that they got started and got as high as they did when Cliff was in the band is completely ridiculous, really, when you think about it. The fact that they went on to be the biggest band in the world from that genre of music is a whole other conversation, and that still blows my mind to this day.
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't even think they expected it in those early days to take off as quickly as it did.
And it's interesting when you say how quickly it happened for them. I'm not sure it felt like it was particularly quick from the inside. James, for example, I think he was talking about this recently. He was asked about wealth and how it had affected him. And he said, well, fortunately, their wealth accrued itself fairly slowly. It didn't all arrive in one go. It took some years for them to sort of ascend to the levels of affluence where they now are, which I think is healthy. So, and also, the hours and days and weeks and months of tour buses and whatever you had before tour buses, right? Band members' cars, those little gigs in the middle of nowhere across Europe and across America. That must have felt like an exhausting few years, Lars himself has said, actually, that they were living on the poverty line as late as Justice, right? So that's 7 years after they started.
I was going to ask, when does the money start to come in? So it's actually even
around
after
Justice.
Cliff is gone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Really?
I mean,
Yeah,
I think maybe the poverty line is stretching it a little bit, right? I think they could make a living and survive without doing day jobs when they were off tour by puppets, for sure. And then by the time Justice rolled around in '88, then you had MTV support and so on and so on, the major label deal, obviously. So things probably looked up from that point. So again, I was just trying to think of a way of saying that actually I don't think it felt that quick. It probably took 6 or 7 years before their lifestyles were affected, I think, in that sense.
Where did Cliff grow up? What was his childhood like? His mom says he was always his own person.
Seems that way. I wish I'd met him. I was only 15 when he died. So never got a chance to meet him. I would have loved to have hung out with him. I think what Jan Burton meant was that he had this sort of fiercely independent streak. He grew up in Castro Valley, as I understand it, a sort of a quiet suburb of San Francisco. And he liked his sort of outdoorsy pursuits, He would go fishing. In fact, an interesting point that I may have been unearthed before I discovered it, but if you look at his picking hand when he's playing bass, his ring finger is up and his pinky is hanging down, which is not typical for a bass player who plucks with 2 fingers. And the reason why that was that he got a fish hook caught in his hand when he was fishing and injured one of the tendons. So if you look at his right hand, you'll see this finger sticking down, whereas normally it would be tucked up into your palm. It's a small detail, but that's the kind of thing the book is full of, actually.
Sure. But this is the stuff we hear always the Tony Iommi story. His finger gets cut off, so he makes his own like a thimble almost. Yeah. And Jerry Garcia, the same thing. That leads to his finger picking style. So I never knew that until the book.
These little things are what build the picture of the man. We know the big story, we know about the bass fills in The Call of Cthulhu, right? Because a lot of people know that stuff, and we know the details of poor Cliff's tragic end, but the little details about how he lived, I think that's part of the author's job, to try and include those. I did a book a few years ago with a guy called Woody Woodmansey, who was the drummer in The Spiders from Mars with David Bowie, right? The reason why I'm saying this is that I tried in that book, it was his autobiography, right? So I tried in that book to bring to the reader what it was like to walk downstairs and David Bowie is making toast for your breakfast, right? not necessarily to go on stage as Ziggy Stardust and travel America, although that stuff is in there too. But the tiny details, right? Like, so David and his wife Angie Bowie would cook dinner, and they weren't very good cooks, you know, and the food was kind of crap. So that kind of detail, I think, humanizes people and brings them to the reader. And that was so much the goal with Cliff. I think I did, I don't know, 75 interviews or something for that book. And when people told me these really small details about, you know, oh God, another one is, you know, he wore these bell-bottom jeans at a time when they were super uncool.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Another example of him being his own man, right? As his mother described him. Right before he died, he showed up in a pair of tight jeans to his girlfriend Corinne and said, "What do you think of these?" Right? So he was about to change that trivial detail of his image, and we never got to see it. So, you know, these funny, almost meaningless details, really. But if you have enough of them, they add up to
That's the stuff
to
people
a
love.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fans love
So that
stuff.
was what I wanted to do. I thought all you can really do when someone has died is serve their memory in the right way and pay tribute to their family. And I think the job of presenting him as he really was the best thing I could do. And that meant introducing all those funny little details that go up to make up a life.
He truly was. And right to the end, I think it was the very last interview he did, or a press conference. It was an interview he did, and you have it in the book. He was unaffected by the media. Like, he was unaffected by critics. That wasn't going to change their approach to the music in the future. It just didn't matter. And I believe it. I mean, some people will say it, but he seemed like that type of guy. He was just blocked it all out.
You know, he just had one mission, which was to do well as a bass player. I think he had an agreement with his parents where they had said, "We will support you for a couple of years while you try and make it as a musician. After that, you're on your own," which is great. I have the same agreement with my son. So he had a goal. His parents gave him a goal with a deadline, and he had achieved that many times over, of course, by the time he died. But he was driven for that reason, you know, many other reasons. He just wanted to do it right. And the other thing we have to remember is that, and it's another awful detail, his brother Scott died young of a brain hemorrhage, I believe, when Cliff was, I think, 13. So first the family has to go through that. And, you know, anybody who's a parent or a dad or a mom will understand how seismic that must be. That gave Cliff drive as well. He's told his mother he wanted to master bass for his brother. So there was that as well. So there was trauma in his, no pun intended, that was the name of his band. There was trauma in his background too. All of which does add up to a complex and interesting character, I have to say. So as a journalist, it was not only a challenge, it was also very interesting to try and create the full picture of the man.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Was Trauma his first official band, or
No, not his first band, because he had various pickup bands. He was close with Mike Bordin and Jim Martin, who went on to be in Faith No More, and they did various little bands together. You know, he had one called Agents of Misfortune, and you know, a few other little bands like that. So, but Trauma was his first, I guess, recording and performing band of any note.
Right.
And I spoke to a couple of those guys. They never really went anywhere. I think it's in the book, but I can't remember. They had a track on one of Metal Blade's Metal Massacre albums, but I think that was about as far as they went. They're still going, actually, with a different lineup. And their story has not really been fully told. On YouTube, there used to be, there probably still is, an EPK of their band playing. And the drummer has this kind of flaming drumstick thing. And Cliff does the Anesthesia solo, or a version of it. I don't know if it's still there. It was not long ago, and it's a great bit of video. So you can see Trauma had a little bit of potential, but again, like so many bands, they went nowhere, you know? And it could have been Metallica who went nowhere. It's very mysterious, really.
And that's when James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich discover Cliff, around 1982, when he's in Trauma. What was the songwriting process in those early days when Cliff was in the band? And is it different from what it would become after he passed?
Well, fundamentally, I mean, Cliff played a part in the songwriting, definitely, but Lars and James have always been the engine room, I guess. And they have that down, don't they, to a fine art. James writes the lyrics, comes up with most of the riffs, not all of them. Lars is the master arranger and does come up with some riffs himself. I think it was Mustaine, Dave Mustaine, I think it was him who recently said that the little chromatic riff from Master of Puppets, you know, now famous through Stranger Things to a whole generation of people who never heard of it before. Lars came up with that. And Yeah, and James professionalized it, made it a lot tighter. But so no, I think no, Cliff definitely had his parts that he put on. Like he said, that there are 3 or 4 or 5 songs where you have an intro or a bass solo or just a fantastic little interlude of bass that is all him. But primarily the songwriting came from James and actually also from Dave Mustaine in the early days as well.
And as you mentioned, he cited Geezer Butler, Steve Harris of Iron Maiden as his influences. And you say in the book that if you're familiar in Geddy Lee, and you write that if you're familiar with Cliff's playing, you will understand why. Can you expand on that a little bit? And what stands out to you about his style of playing?
Well, this is really interesting. I don't know if you know, but I was the editor of Bass Player magazine for quite some years.
Yes.
Right. I spent a lot of time analyzing his techniques and his fills, basically, which is what really define a bass player, as well as your groove, and your attack and all those sort of hard to define things. The influence of Geddy, I think, is probably more of an attitude thing. There are lots of elaborate fills in Cliff's playing that are rather Geddy Lee-esque. Not in the sense that he cloned anything to do with Rush, more that there was a kind of an inventive, slightly progressive, musically educated, harmonically advanced way to play. Geezer Butler, he's primarily a blues-influenced bass player. So you don't hear lots and lots of blues in Cliff's playing because that wasn't his thing. And then with Steve Harris as well, you have all this elaborate fingerstyle stuff. And again, but you can hear much more of Steve Harris in the bass playing of Frank Bello, actually, than you can of Cliff Burton. The punk thing was massive for Cliff. And one way that you can understand that is if you seek out Cliff's isolated bass parts on YouTube, and there's quite a few there. Certainly up until Puppets, he had this, and certainly on Ride the Lightning, really, he had this incredibly distorted bass tone. And I would love to have asked a couple of the mixers about this, of those albums. The bass, apart from the solo parts, is mixed quite low on those records. And I'm wondering whether that super aggressive, obnoxious tone that he had, which is really, really overdriven, required him to be fairly low in the mix, because otherwise you wouldn't get the precision of James's rhythm parts and the mix wouldn't sound right.
I want to ask about that first album now, because the book coincides with the 40th anniversary of Metallica's debut, Kill 'Em All. And that's released July 83. So we're coming up on the anniversary. Whiplash, Jumpin' Fire, The Four Horsemen, Seek and Destroy. They're all classics, of course. What was your first impression of that album? And how has it stood up 40 years later?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love this kind of stuff. So
because we all perceive them differently as the years go on. You revisit something, you say, I never heard that part, Yeah.
And your perception of it changes as you change. See, I was a big Puppets fan, right? I was 16 years old. Listened to Master of Puppets all day, every day. And I also listened to Slayer. Rain and Blood was my thing. So those 2 thrash albums, as well as all the other stuff that I listened to back then, right? But if it was metal, it was those 2 records. And with both bands, they were the first albums that I had come across by those groups, right? Their third records. So when I went back and revisited the earlier stuff, I remember being quite surprised at Kill 'Em All by how raw it was. I mean, it's almost unproduced, that record, right? Everything's different about it. Lars's drums are pretty primitive. The guitar tones are really sort of, they're heavy, but they're kind of squeaky. There's not an awful lot of sophistication to them. Which all went away by the second album, of course, right? That's a really slick sounding record for kids in 1984, on a very small budget in Denmark. So the first album, I think, is a lot of fun, and there's a couple of big adrenaline moments that make you want to bang your head if you're not too old to do so, which I think I probably am at this point. I love some of the underrated tracks. No Remorse is a big one for me. I remember playing that the back end of No Remorse is a really brutal, fast part. In fact, later it was covered by the death metal band Cannibal Corpse for good reason, because it's an insanely heavy song. I remember playing it really, really loud when I was a kid, and my parents being pissed off, which is a funny memory. How does it stand up? It sure does. I mean, the lyrics are just so bad they're good. What is it? Bang your head against the stage like you never did before. Make it ring, make it bleed, make it really sore. I mean, I love that so much. Those are the words of a pissed off 17-year-old writing his first metal song. I mean, dreaming of stardom. But I wouldn't change them. I mean, they're a snapshot of where they were. Metal itself was so naive, right? It was still very much Ronnie Dio slaying dragons, right? And that was what was so fun about it, and so unserious. So no, I like it. Do I ever listen to it for pleasure? Probably not. I think For the early Metallica songs, I prefer to hear them live, to hear a live recording or a video of them doing them, because I think they stand up better now, you know. But it's fun. I'm nostalgic about it.
The track Anesthesia, Pulling Teeth, it's kind of like, that's kind of like his Eddie Van Halen Eruption moment, right? It's a track on the album where he takes center stage, as you put it in the book. To include this on a heavy metal album at the time was enormously audacious. That's how you write it. What are the origins of this instrumental, and can you break down what we're hearing on this? Because there's some blues, some classical, there's some trippy Hendrix stuff going on here.
Yeah. Almost sort of weird, shuffly, almost folky stuff as well. I you know, if Cliff were here, he would not say that was derived from folk, but there's this kind of doom doodle doodle doom, which is almost Thin Lizzy-esque, you know, almost like a little bit of the sort of Celtic sound. But it's primarily sort of these triads, you know, do 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 do, which are influenced very much by J.S. Bach, you know. Without that sophistication, okay, we shouldn't. And that leads me to an important point, actually. If Cliff were here now, right, listening to us talk about anesthesia, I have no doubt whatsoever that he would laugh and say, listen, thanks, guys, but that was the work of a very, very young musician, right? What I'm doing now is 100 times better and 100 times more sophisticated. So just as you and I, when we think about what we did when we were that young, you know, it doesn't compare to what we can do professionally now, right? So I tried to bear that in mind, you know. I don't want people to think of it as the peak of Cliff Burton's powers. It's the peak of Cliff Burton's powers when he was a kid, right? Which makes it all the more remarkable that it got done. The fact that Metallica allowed it on the record is really an indicator of the regard that they held Cliff in, I think. You know, I mean, okay, I don't want to say it takes up the entirety of the record. It's a 4-minute solo. It goes straight into Whiplash. You know, and I think live, it was one of those great moments where the band could go off and take a moment. James could have a beer or whatever it was. So yeah, and then the back end of the solo, Anesthesia, basically is this giant overdriven workout for his wah pedal. It's really quite something. And I think nowadays, I bet you by now, actually, if he was still alive, they would have done a professional re-recording of that, and it would have been cleaned up. And I'm sure people like me would probably complain and say, "Oh, it's taken all the fun out of it, and it's taken the raw edges and the sharp bits and the slightly, the feedback and all that stuff." So what it really is an expression of Cliff's character at that point in his life. You know, it's a bit jerky, it's not perfect, but the spirit and the attitude is completely there.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Joe McIver's here to talk about the revised third edition of his book, originally released 2009, To Live Is to Die, The Life and Death of Metallica's Cliff Burton. And I want to ask you about my personal favorite Metallica album, which is Ride the Lightning, because the first time I heard it, my older brother had the cassette, and the cover pulled me in, I'll admit. It's old school. It's like the old vinyl days. The cover.
It's great.
I mean, I knew about him because at that time there was the video for One that was on all the time. And saw it there, and I listened to it, and I loved it, start to finish. Fire with Fire, and the title track, For Whom the Bell Tolls, Fade to Black. You write in chapter 7, it's beyond belief that these guys barely into their 20s took such a gigantic leap forward from the first album in terms of musical and lyrical sophistication. And you say much of this comes down to Cliff. Can you talk about his influence on this album?
To this day, I can't really think easily of a band that made such a huge leap in quality from the first to the second record. You know, they were still kids. So if that album came out in 84, released, probably recorded in 84, I mean, they were at best 20, 21 years old, which blows my mind. It's something to do with the production as well. They had a professional producer. So the late Paul Curcio, who produced the first record, according to what the band said, didn't really do much. Flemming Rasmussen, the Danish producer at Sweet Silence, who also did Puppets and Justice, was a master. He understood exactly what they needed. I did a long interview with him for this book, and he knew how to get the best out of them in difficult conditions, because even though the album sounds great, it wasn't recorded on a huge budget, right? So Cliff is all over it in the sense that compositionally there's quite a lot of interesting Cliff stuff, but he is mixed quite low. He's mixed quite high on Kill 'Em All, to the extent you can hear some of the little fills that he does that are not that consequential, but you can still hear them. It must be that he stepped right up compositionally, I think. So he has that solo at the beginning of For Whom the Bell Tolls. It's not even a solo, really, is it? It's the opening riff, you know, do 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 do, which really makes it. It's a great little piece. And then he's all over the Call of Cthulhu. And that's actually more interesting in a sense because he's mixed so low. He has his wah pedal and he steps on it at the end of every couple of phrases and does this big sort of wow. But you can't really hear it unless you know it's there and you make an effort to get in there and really, really listen deeply to what he's doing. But if you can do, or you can find an isolated bass part for that song, then you're in for a treat because he's all over it. He's really, really playing around the riff, which is what we as bass players always long to be able to do, but it's not always appropriate, right? And in fact, Kirk told me that at times Cliff would overplay, which is something that young virtuoso musicians with skills and with something to prove often do. And the bass player's role is usually, but not always, to be supportive. So the fact that Cliff did not made him even more of an unusual bass player, right? So,
well, having said that, Joel, was he
yeah,
disappointed in the mix?
it's a great question. He never said that, but he didn't do an awful lot of press.
Okay.
So yeah, even back then, most of the press was done by Lars and James. So Cliff would do a little bit of talking here and there, but he didn't, as you said earlier, that the opinions of the press didn't really matter that much to him, and he didn't really contribute to that dialogue either. He did what he did. Now, as the years passed and interest in Metallica grew, I am sure that had he been around for the Justice and Black Album times, then there would have been much more input and much more on the record of what Cliff actually said. So no, would he have been disappointed? I can't imagine he wasn't. I haven't tracked down anybody who said, yeah, Cliff was pissed off that he was mixed low on that record.
He was more of a team player?
Solo parts.
He was more of a team player?
He was definitely a team player. He loved being in Metallica. I mean, that's an absolute fact. All the people I've spoken to, and there were many who were in Cliff's orbit, knew how much he was passionate about the band, just wanted it to be successful, and he could see it was going somewhere. He had ambitions. He wanted to buy them a house. He was going to get married to Corinne and settle down. So he had life goals, and he wanted the band to help him get there, and he wanted the band to be successful. So no, expressing annoyance at being mixed low, I've never come across that. That would be interesting.
What I find when I listen to that album, it does not sound at all like it comes from the year 1984. It's not of its time.
You've probably read Slash's autobiography. He wrote in it something which really stuck with me. He said, to me, the most 80s year of the 80s was 1987.
Yeah.
And I totally got why, right? 87 was Whitesnake, it was Big Hair, it was big 80s events happened kind of then. So the reason why I mentioned that is that Ride the Lightning doesn't sound like an 80s album, It's
not at all.
The production isn't old fashioned. The lyrics are really good, You're not thinking, these are cheesy old lyrics by some kid, as we did with the first record, right? Yes, it's very metal and a lot of it's biblical and all that stuff, but it's not. None of it is embarrassing or youthful or kind of cringe. There is that one song, Escape, which no one likes, really. Even Metallica don't like it. It was played for the first time, wasn't it, a couple of years ago? And it's not terrible. It's just them moving in a little bit of a sort of a sing-along commercial direction, which didn't suit them. But I think we can forgive them that, especially given the masterpiece which was to follow.
Master of Puppets, came out March of 86. The band's last with Cliff Burton. James Hetfield says in your book the band was peaking by this time. Battery, the title track, The Thing That Should Not Be, Welcome Home Sanitarium, Disposable Heroes, Leper Messiah, the instrumental, Orion, and Damage Inc. 8 tracks. Cliff said the title track was his favorite from the album and the best the band did up until that point. And there's an interesting observation from you in this book. And you write about Cliff playing unselfishly in the midsection of this song. We were just talking about this, team player. Can you expand on that and his overall approach to playing within the band structure?
Right. So either he had gained a bit of experience and maturity by this point, or someone had had a word with him about not overplaying, because he does play more supportively on this record. But at the same time, he's also given more solo space than any other previous Metallica album. So just to run through them, the parts where Cliff is most audible because he's doing solo stuff is first of all in the song Orion, where he does the intro. He does a little bass break in the middle, which is barely audible, but it's beautiful. And then he does a solo at the end, a giant distorted solo, which was a guitar solo originally that Kirk was going to play. But for some reason, Kirk wasn't in the studio that day, so Cliff played it on bass, right? And that was a little nugget that I didn't know about before I did this book, although apparently that's kind of known. And then, of course, he does the intro to Damage Incorporated, which is amazing to me. That whole song, I mean, the two very, very fast songs, Damage Incorporated and Disposable Heroes. How Cliff pulled that off with the fingerstyle playing, I do not know. A lot of bass players in the thrash bands were switching over to picks at the time. No one who's not a bass player will care about this, but Tom Araya of Slayer told me that he started using a pick for Raining Blood. David Ellefson of Megadeth was obviously a pick player. Even Frank Bello of Anthrax, famously a fingerstyle player, used a pick for one or two of their faster songs. So he has his solo spots. He is mixed fairly low, but he's also playing fairly sportively. Now, the specific point I made about Master of Puppets and the midsection of that song is that that's the dual harmony solo between James and Kirk, the famous one. And if Cliff were to overplay at that point, it would mess things up and get in the way of what is a really beautiful melody and a beautiful harmony. So you can hear him throwing in the odd little interesting sort of little fill, but it's tasteful and it serves the song. So all those years I edited Bass Player magazine, and bass players told me about their approach. Serving the song was the phrase that I was always hearing. Playing what the song needs, not what you feel you need to say to show everybody how good you are. And I think Cliff was at that point now. He'd matured as a bass player. He had his solo spots, but those solo parts are not frivolously extravagant, right? They're complex and they're technically challenging, but there's no unnecessary showing off. So he had become a bass player for the ages by this point, and yet he was in this thrash metal world, which blows my mind because it's not traditionally the home of virtuoso bass players, the ones we just mentioned aside. Puppets, I mean, to me, it's not just Metallica's best record, and really that's a generational question anyway. You ask people under 30 what their favorite record Metallica is, and it probably won't be Puppets. You ask people, of all generations now, where they stand on Metallica, you'll get a different answer each time, quite rightly. But I do think that in terms of musical sophistication, that's where they peaked. And at the same time, those songs are catchy as hell as well. You don't forget any of them. There's no escape on that record, right? There's no slightly dodgy song that they really didn't need to record. Those 8 songs, they're all excellent, beautifully put together and memorable,
To me, that's the ultimate compliment when an artist has something that's catchy, yet also musically sophisticated, to combine those two things.
And it's, songwriting's not easy, it's what is easier, relatively easy, is writing super complicated jazz or prog, right? Or technical metal, right? All you have to do is acquire the chops to do those things, which is not easy, but it's doable. Writing sort of simpler songs, like Metallica did on the Black Album, actually, is the relevant example, is much more difficult. Especially nowadays it's a different time. You're likely to replicate something that was recorded before much more readily than you were. I was interviewing Kerry King of Slayer about this a few years ago, and he told me that back then, 86, 87, 88, all the riffs were there for the taking, right? So Sabbath had obviously built a career on great riffs, but they weren't Metallica and Slayer style riffs. So the cupboard was full. You opened it and the riffs were there. So they did have an advantage in that sense, which is probably one reason why you don't hear a Master of Puppets nowadays or a Black Album nowadays, because everything sounds slightly derivative, to listeners of a certain age. I mean, I have a viewpoint about that as well, which is that, if you or I were 15 years old now, we'd be loving today's metal scene, and saying this is all so fresh and it's all so new. But when you've been around a few years and you've heard a few things, you've heard it all a few times, haven't you?
Sure. Yeah, just like movies. You see a movie and it's a new movie, but you're like, I feel like I've seen this before. The plot line.
There's only so much culture, right? The question about the Black Album, it's so relevant to this book, even though Cliff is nowhere near being on it, right? He'd been gone 5 years by the time that was released. But people asking me about that, what would have Cliff have thought of the Black Album? Would there have been a Black Album? And that is a long and interesting conversation. But to sum it up, my view is that, probably there would have been. Cliff, I think, had enough of the sort of heads down thrash stuff by the time the Puppet cycle was done or nearly done. He didn't get to see all of it. They went prog on Justice for a while, and that was partly to do at least with them wanting to show off their chops and feeling insecure about them. And quite rightly, then that led to them wanting to dial it all down and do something simple and, in fairness, build their fame and make some money as MTV stars, you know what I mean? I think Cliff would have been all over that. I think he would have been keen.
I think I'm with you on that too. It seems like he had that personality that they all had, which is let's try different things. Let's not just do the same thing over and over again.
Let's be as big as we can be, right?
Let's be as big as we can be. Yep.
After all these years, stuck in the back of a terrible tour bus with no money, if we have the opportunity to make this thing a global phenomenon, take it. And, when you put it like that, it doesn't sound unreasonable.
September 27th, 1986, all comes to an end, and he was 24 years
Correct.
old, just a kid. There were rumors about why Cliff took that bunk on the right-hand side of the tour bus that night, and this is in Sweden where the bus crashed.
Yeah.
It could have gone to Kirk. They decided over a card game, and he confirmed to you that's what happened, right? Is this the first? Was this the first we ever heard of that confirmation back in 2009 when the first edition came out?
So I had read this story that neither of them wanted to take a particular bunk, so they cut a deck of cards, and the ace of spades was pulled, and that was why the fatal bunk went to Cliff. So I'd heard this story. Had I heard it formally confirmed by a member of Metallica? No, I don't think I had. That's not to say it had been. The story must have come from somewhere, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to recall the Behind the Music VH1. Did they talk about it on that one? Which would have been, I think, late 90s, early 2000s, I think. I seem to remember Kirk talking about it on camera.
Yeah. I think my point might have been, come on, was it really the ace of spades? That's almost too cheesy. I can get that you won you picked a higher card, but was it actually the ace of spades? And he laughed and said, I know it sounds like bullshit, but no, that's a fact. So that certainly had not been confirmed. And again, it's a minor detail, but there's something quite sinister about that, isn't it? And so weird. So yeah, interestingly, last year, the Swedish government, or the local government up in the town of Ljungby, which is a couple of hours drive north of Copenhagen as you head up Sweden, they opened a museum, a Cliff Burton museum on the crash site. For the last 15 years or so, there has been a headstone there. And that was placed there not by Metallica or anyone to do with them, but by members of their Swedish fan club, all of whom I've met now and are great people. And they got this incredible artist to design this beautiful thing. If you ever find yourself, Eric, heading north up through Sweden, make sure you stop at this spot. In fact, you have to, because there's only one major road that goes up there all the way to Stockholm. So yeah, I'm telling the story backwards because I'm talking about the new museum as opposed to the actual event. But essentially, over the years, the number of people who come to pay their respects to Cliff has grown, right? It's not diminished, it's grown over the years. Now that says an awful lot about A, Metallica, and B, Cliff era Metallica, which is something that I talk about a lot in the very new edition of the book, because that's becoming more and more clear as years pass, right? That his profile is growing. Now, no one would have spotted that, right? This is a long time ago that he died. And yet his profile is growing, which is really interesting to me on all sorts of cultural levels, right? So yeah, they opened it last year. As the editor and bass player, I was invited to come over and give a speech, but also as the author of the Cliff book as well. Again, the only Cliff book there is. So I went over there, and it's amazing, right? You're in the middle of nowhere, right? It's this, like, I don't know, countryside in the middle of Sweden, beautiful. And you go into this, over here we call it a service station. Like, it's where you go to get gas for your vehicle and get some food and keep going on a long journey, right?
Right.
So there's that. You drive in, there's a service station for you to get some gas. Then there's a moose reserve, right? And a hunting store and the Cliff Burton Museum.
Oh, man.
In this kind of nowhere area of Sweden. There is the town of Ljungby, which is a kind of medium-sized little place. It's quite cute. That's like 10 minutes away. Anyway, so there's this museum run by this amazing couple who really helped me out with everything I was doing. I was writing a report and, like I say, giving a speech. And Frank Bello came in on a Zoom call and talked to everyone. And there was a tribute band. And it's heartbreaking because you drive 10 minutes away and there's this stone, and you gather around and you shed a tear. The place is you can't not. And then if you walk about 100 meters away from this stone, you see the curve in the road where the bus crashed, and you can stand right there. And if you have a photo of the event, which you can get online, they happen to be in my book as well, but you can find them online, of the bus fallen on its side, you're exactly there. So what happened was, for reasons unknown, and it could have been an error of the driver, although that was never proven, despite the efforts of me and people like me who've tried to find out who he was and where he is, right, if he's still alive. Bus was driving along and its right-hand wheels drifted off the road, right? Frankly, like any of us could do, actually. And because of that, the right-hand side of the bus started to drag, and the bus rotated 180 degrees, came to a stop by the side of the road, and sort of slowly tipped over on its side, right? Cliff was sleeping on the side of the bus that was falling, and he was ejected through the window, which is an interesting one because people go, how could you fly through the window? But this was not a professional quality bus, really, by today's standards. So he went through the window, which broke, and the bus landed on him, and he was crushed to death. And you can read in great detail about the aftermath of that. I managed to speak to the first journalist on the scene, who was from the local newspaper. He gave me a detailed interview. In fact, how did we do it? I think he faxed me his answers in Swedish, so I had to get a Swedish friend to translate for me.
Wow.
And then
The
they lifted
roadie,
the
too.
bus
You
up.
spoke with the roadie who was on the tour bus.
John Marshall, yeah. So John Marshall had played guitar for James, who had injured his arm he'd broken it skateboarding. So John was playing rhythm guitar on that tour, but he had also been a roadie. And oh man, it's a whole story. I mean, it's just horrendous. Cliff was just 24. I often think about the death of Randy Rhoads when I think about the death of Cliff Burton. It was so pointless
Right.
and so avoidable, right?
Just-
And so
yeah.
and cruel, because it robbed everyone of his skill and his talent and everything that was waiting to be unleashed by him and Randy. So those two events are sadly similar.
And for
And
the
in
guys
fact,
in the
when I
band
was-
to have to just see it, right? Because James is the one who's the first witness.
Yeah,
Yeah,
James
Cliff.
climbed out of the bus and saw Cliff's legs sticking out.
Right. And Kirk,
Yeah.
that card game, I mean, does that haunt him? I mean, they had to. I mean, did they talk to anybody about it? Did they see any like therapist or something? Because I would imagine something like that, just the PTSD from
Right.
that.
So, well, this is a whole other conversation, Eric. But they have talked at length over the years about how they basically dived into a bottle, and that was how they dealt with it.
Mm.
There wasn't really any serious attempt at what we would do nowadays. There would be counseling and there would be therapy and there would be all sorts of help for them. But that just wasn't the environment back then for a band of this stature, which was not great in 1986. So no, and young people anyway, or it's different now, isn't it? Today's generation of young kids, they understand the importance of mental health and maintaining it. And it would be a different scenario now, thank God. But back then, those tools weren't available. So they have often talked about how Cliff's successor, Jason Newsted, got an awful lot of hazing and a lot of kind of abuse is too strong a word, but it was kind of like, and bullying is too strong a word, but it was kind of good-natured versions of those things as a kind of possibly a reaction to the guilt they felt over Cliff not being there anymore. And it's just an incredible seismic transition for a band of that age to go through. I'm sure it toughened them up and made them stronger. But your question about how they dealt with the grief, if they ever did, I don't think they ever really did. Not really. There was the period of therapy they had around Some Kind of Monster, which I think was useful for them, even though it was filmed for public consumption, which is a curious thing to do, to this day. But I'm sure that was a help for them.
Much like AC/DC after Bon Scott passed, get right back to work. Didn't take long for Metallica to move forward. I mean, they knew that's what Cliff would have wanted.
Completely. There are nuances, though, aren't there? I mean, like Bon essentially drank himself to death. Well, inadvertently. It wasn't a suicide attempt. It was an accident, and you could say Cliff's death was an accident as well. But somebody had to be at fault in that accident. The driver was arrested as a formality, not because he was charged, but because he was arrested because there'd been a fatality, and he was let go because no evidence could be found that he had made that much of an error, a fatal error that killed Cliff. Black ice was mentioned. No black ice was
Right.
was
That was
was
the
seen.
debate. Yeah.
This was September. In theory, it could have been cold. I really checked this actually. I spoke to a lot of people who were there on the scene and said, and I've checked weather records for that date in history as well at that location. It seems to be unlikely that on September the 27th you would have black ice, right? Because the weather was fine. It wasn't raining. It wasn't even that cold. It's not beyond the realms of imagination that it could happen. All these theories abound, but the fact is there was no closure because no real reason for the crash was discovered. So
Yeah.
I think that in itself is just as damaging. The fact that there was no explanation. The fact is that Bon Scott overdosed. There was an explanation, right? Randy Rhoads was in a plane crash. It was understood why it happened. Dimebag, bless his heart, who I also met, was murdered, and that's a whole other level of tragedy. But I think it helps when you understand why something happened, and the fact that it is still not fully understood all these years later. And I really, really put my efforts into this, into trying to figure out what the hell happened back then. And there is no answer. I think that must be difficult for them to live with even now.
Well, there is something you write in the book that stood out, and I wonder if you can expand on it. And here's the quote. Without Cliff, as the other members of Metallica have stated on many occasions, the band would have probably have taken a rather different route and one that might have reaped far fewer rewards. That's how important he was to Metallica and, by extension, to the whole of heavy metal. What do you think that route would have been, and how would it have changed the course of Metallica and heavy metal history, in your opinion, if not for Cliff Burton?
Well, had there been no Cliff, right, they would have stayed for a while at least with Ron McGovney, their bass player, who Cliff replaced, right? Now, Ron, as I understand it, I couldn't get through to him. Did I speak to him? I can't remember if I didn't talk to him for this book, but I think I've spoken to him at some point or other. Decent guy, right? Good guy. Took a lot of shit off Metallica, you know, trying to run that band when they were just young kids. He paid for everything. He drove them everywhere, you know. Mustaine was a dick to him, and he quit quite rightly. But he wasn't really born to be on the stage. You know what I mean? So had they stayed with him, it's quite possible that the band would have just sort of faltered and petered out, you know. What Cliff gave them was a fire to get good and stay good, because he was so good, right? And so serious and so committed. And they made that commitment. They moved to San Francisco. I've done that drive. It's like 8 hours or something, isn't it? I mean, it's quite a big old hike, right? You wouldn't,
Yeah.
you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't leave your families and friends for no reason, right? So those circumstances certainly solidified Metallica. Now they had a real reason to take things seriously. And like I said before, the alternative would have been for them to just peter out, you know, and just, let's do something else, you know. And, you know, Lars certainly had no need to be in a band, you know. He was from a cultured, educated, affluent family. James would no doubt have done something else. There comes a point, doesn't there, in whatever we do, not just musicians, but whatever we as people do, where we suddenly decide to take things a little bit more seriously, don't we? And if we don't do that, then we risk never really fulfilling our potential, do we? You know, and some of us don't. You know, some of us don't. In Metallica's case, I think it was meeting Cliff and realizing that to match Cliff, they needed to step up their game significantly. So the second part of the statement that you just mentioned, where I said this has affected the whole of heavy metal, I stand by that statement, but in fairness, it is the kind of thing that we journalists like to do. You know, we kind of draw big kind of implications and say, and so the whole of history was affected, you know. But actually, I stand by that because Metallica went on to be pioneers in all the ways that we know about that don't need explaining. And had they not been there, because Cliff never happened and because they never became a serious force, things would have been different, you know. Would Slayer have been inspired to do what they did? You know, with the whole wave of thrash metal that followed in Metallica, and then the whole wave of death and black metal that followed that have come to pass. Does it matter on a global scale? Could society have managed without extreme metal? I suggest it could have done, right? But if you're into that music and the culture that goes with it, and the interesting sort of political implications and nuances that come with it, it's important, as well as being really entertaining and fun, you know, and a great, interesting culture. And that's ultimately borne out by the fact, and again, I've mentioned this before, that Metallica are so huge now. Could the world have lived without the Foo Fighters or Green Day or the Rolling Stones or U2 or Adele or Rihanna or any of those giant musical forces, right? Yes, the world would have been fine. But we are richer culturally, aren't we, with those people? And that's how I feel about Metallica as well. Yeah, they've just started their world tour, haven't they? So we're not going to be able to escape them for the next couple of years, yeah.
I think they brought a legitimacy to their genre, thanks to Cliff, that before Metallica, that genre was looked down on. Just a bunch of, you know, long hair.
It was completely mocked.
Yeah.
And they didn't help themselves, right? Those lyrics that we talked about, you know, it wasn't like, it was very difficult to take seriously. But then suddenly, when you had a song like Damage Incorporated or Orion or The Call of Cthulhu, which was a symphonically fantastic piece of music, you had to take it seriously. And as we've been saying, so much of that is down to Cliff's music and his attitude.
I spoke with an author who wrote an entire book on just the lyrics. And as you get into the second and the third album and moving forward, those are some pretty impressive lyrics for a kid, James Hetfield. Yeah. I mean, it's like,
was it William Owen?
Yes.
Good friend of mine.
Oh, that's great. William was phenomenal book.
Bill is a professor of philosophy.
Yep.
Now, I put it to you that there were no other philosophy professors in 1986, writing books about how important philosophically the lyrics of Black Sabbath or Iron Maiden were, right? Honestly, I think Metallica pioneered that, partly because of James's self-confessional sort of style, which resonates with so much of us, as well as the kind of, thrilling biblical epic stuff as well.
But that
And these are
creative
just,
spirit of Cliff to push forward, go as far as you
think so.
can, go above and
I
beyond.
don't want to say all of their success is down to Cliff. I think that would
Right.
be overstating it. But I think a large part of their forward motion in that part of their careers was definitely down to Cliff. He was very, very important to their success. I mean, that there's no doubt about that.
So yeah, I'll give you the final word on this, on Cliff Burton, and set it up with what you write in the latest edition of the book, which people definitely need to go out and get. You say his achievements tend to be condensed over time in a couple of high water marks, and during your time as the editor of Bass Guitar Magazine, which by the way was from 2018 to 2022. Do I got that right?
So I was the editor of Bass Guitar Magazine from 2012 to 2018, and then the editor of Bass Player Magazine from 2018 to 2022. Yeah, it's a nuance.
You emphasize to readers that Cliff could not and should not be reduced to a simple meme of a headbanging hippie who played 3 famous solo parts, referring to the songs Anesthesia, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Orion. What do you feel people should know about Cliff Burton today and for years to come?
That he was a whole person. There was much more to him than just the heavy metal trope or meme or cliche. And that what you can do as a sort of quietly spoken but determined person is it can be huge, can have huge consequences. And when we are robbed of that person through tragic circumstance, as we have been with Cliff, the best thing you can do is acknowledge that was a whole person who did wonderful things. Think about those skills, think about what those achievements were, apply them to your own life, I think, and pay tribute where it's deserved. And try to be like these people. That's what I think, And that means acknowledging people's strengths and their flaws and their weaknesses, Great things can come from these tiny little moments, The fact that Lars and James saw him headbanging like that and it changed their entire trajectory. These things can and do happen, and they are to be appreciated and cherished.
To Live is to Die, The Life and Death of Metallica's Cliff Burton. Revised 3rd edition is out now through Jawbone Press, and you can get it wherever books are sold. It's out there. Any websites that you want to let people know about, Joel? How about social media? I think we are on Instagram. I think we're following each other on Instagram.
Yes, I am. Yeah, it's just Joel McIver on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Joel, thanks so much. This was great.
Eric, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
That's it. It's in the books.